for instance, if someone is considered or feels they are being called racist because they are not actively doing something to combat racism, then they can just throw out the whole argument and decide to continue thinking the same way. So that's kind of an argument about, labeling and how we really have to be careful about how we frame this stuff, which I agree. But it's also true that no framing within the anti-racist context has ever been widely acceptable. Like never. The idea of civil rights was not popular during the civil rights era and during the civil rights movement. Um, you know, Anti-racist is very contentious now. I actually tweeted about the lecture that was given yesterday, and Kendi kind of went through a list of historically all the different terms that have been used, and none of them have been popular throughout history. They've all faced a ton of backlash. So I think if we're going to think about it realistically, we have to realize that what Kendi brings up, which is that even though we've made great strides in anti-racist, kind of consciousness here, or at least combating racist laws, racist policies, and racist ideas, racism has also made parallel strides, right? And we basically pretend like that hasn't happened. We really don't acknowledge that. And when people do try to acknowledge it, they are seen as trying to perpetuate racism instead of talking about a present reality. And so I think that that's one of the biggest problems that exists.
I think what you're saying there, and I think what you're saying, which is a point that I can very much appreciate, is that how do I say? So there's numerous concepts you can. There's symbolic racism that kind of came up in the 80s. There's colorblind. There's cultural racism. All these different ways that people try to demonstrate or reveal or expose how racism persists even as we make progress against old-fashioned racism and so on. There's even a book called Good White People, which is, to me at least, at times, is, making points that I can, at other times just they seem almost silly, but I mean, look, it's true that you're always going to encounter resistance from status quo and from reactionary forces and so on. That doesn't necessarily make every attempt at moving forward, quote unquote, the same thing as progress. So I think, and in principle, I assume we can all agree on that. The issue is, when are we making progress and when are we not? To me, that's what the conversation is about. So I don't think white fragility is a concept that makes progress, quote unquote, white fragility.
Why? Can you explain that?
I can. I mean, it'll kind of go down a little tangent, but I guess it'll feed back into the point that I ultimately want to make, which is so. One of the core premises, if not the core premise of white fragility, well, all right, in practice, the main problem with white fragility is it really doesn't allow conversation to take place at all. And the reason I say that is that D'Angelo, and I'll just say D'Angelo as sort of the spokesperson for it because she is the one who came up with the concept as far back as her dissertation, 2004, is that, she has a very she has a framework in mind from which she's coming, a very an approach that is very dogmatic, but it's the way to do it for D'Angelo. And when she brings up things like whiteness as a standpoint, as a she's essentially quoting Ruth Frankenberg, but sorry, my mind is going a lot of different directions. So
it's all right.
I'm trying to be as concise as I can. It's basically a Kafka trap. In other words, her definition is, you know, that, see if I can find the exact definition. You know, it's, you know, people become defensive and, you know, they have reactions of fear, anger, guilt, and shame when they're called out on, you know, and so on. The issue with white fragility is that in practice, as I see in practice, is that any objections that you raise to the paradigm that she's trying to propose or the argument she's trying to make, or when she's trying to point out a quote unquote teachable moment, is that if you don't agree, then you're essentially showing your white fragility. If you're not essentially asking the questions that she wants you to ask, if you're not agreeing with you know, the precepts that she's trying to put forward, then you're essentially showing white fragility. So, you know, for instance, in her dissertation, there's it's essentially an analysis of I think it's 2 4-hour sessions, or it might be a couple 4-hour sessions, but essentially it's interracial dialogue. And there's one point, and hopefully I'll remember all the details of this. I wrote a long article about it, but at some point, one of the, there's a sort of, I don't know if you call it an altercation, but there's a hostile interaction between, I guess her name was Courtney, a white female, and Melina, I think it was, but I might have that wrong, a woman of color. And I think at some point, you know, at this point, the way it's framed, it's clear that a moment of tension has been reached. And so Courtney says, you know, you really want to know what you want to do to end racism or something like that. I don't really remember what the exact quote was. And then there was, you know, a response to that. And anyway, there's this moment of tension. And then she's basically, there's a disagreement about what racism is. Like there's a disagreement about what, you know, and she just gets frustrated and gets up and she's about to walk out. And so for D'Angelo, this is an example of white fragility. Now, it turns out that she was already sort of on the edge of her seat the whole night because she had canceled some other plan that she wanted to go. This is Courtney, that is. She canceled some other plans, and you know, she came because she had missed another session, and so she felt guilty, and so she felt like she had to be there. But you know, we can all imagine being in a situation where we don't want to be one place and we canceled places. So you know, we're just distracted. And, you know, we have all sorts of different reasons for being upset. And so she just kind of had enough, and she kind of, it's like a marital altercation, if you will, I think is one way and so the point being here is that there are a number of reasons you can identify or you can hypothesize as why she got upset and she wanted to walk out. You know, she also said she was kind of like a hot-blooded woman. That's not her quote, but that's the way, you know, that she was, you know, she easily gets stirred, Courtney's words. And so she didn't want to say something that she would regret later. And which to me is a reasonable explanation for wanting to kind of walk out and cool off or whatever. But everything for D'Angelo is white fragility. And that can be very frustrating because it creates an entrapment issue. It's like we can't raise any reasonable objections to the overall paradigm of whiteness, which is what I wanted to get into. Now, at this point, I do want to say as a parenthetical or even just as an addition that, you know, resistance to D'Angelo can itself also function as a Kafka trap. I mean, you want to consider what she has to say, and not everything that she has to say is to be dismissed out of hand. So the point is to create a careful balance between healthy skepticism and healthy consideration of, I guess you might say, an opposing framework or a set of ideas or whatever. And I would argue that D'Angelo does not strike that balance. I mean, you can see in her presentations, there's a tone of belligerence, there's a tone of condescension, and practically speaking, it really works as a kind of Kafka trap. Now, that's in practice. In principle, she's coming from this paradigm of whiteness. and saying that racism is systemic and it depends on socialization and implicit bias and whatever. Now, if you actually investigate the implicit bias literature and the psychology literature, you realize there's all sorts of problems that have arisen in the implicit bias um, paradigm. It's not clear what it is. Our psychologists don't fully agree on what it actually is, but it does not seem to actually measure unconscious prejudice. Um, it has low retest correlation, so you can take the test one day and another day and get different results. People can predict their scores. People can manipulate the tests. Um, the research shows that it doesn't predict behavior very well, and so on and so forth. All sorts of problems that have arisen in the second generation. So the notion of implicit bias is extremely problematic. But if I raise these points for D'Angelo, I'm just showing it white fragility. Like she's ready
Well,
to dismiss,
I,
dismiss
I, I wouldn't say it shows white fragility, but I would say that, do you not believe that unconscious bias exists?
well, I mean, as I write in the book, I say I think we all should probably acknowledge. I could look up the
I mean,
actual
that's a
phrase.
yes or no. Like, do you?
Well, it depends on what we mean when we say unconscious bias.
What I mean is that you have a bias that you're unaware of.
Yeah, but what does it mean to be unaware of it? Does it mean that you're
It means
unaware?
that you don't know, that you may know that there are
Yeah,
biases that
but
other people have,
yeah,
but
but
you
this
don't
isn't
see them within yourself.
right. This is why the question is important. There's a paper by James Jacquard and Hart Blanton, I think is the paper, where they say there's three different ways of actually describing this notion of unconscious bias. Does it mean that you're unaware of the causes of your bias? Does it mean that you're unaware of the effects that your biases have? Or does it mean that you're actually unaware of the biases themselves?
Number
Or is it,
three. I
right.
think I think it's generally number three. I think that's what people are talking about when they talk about it generally.
Yeah, I mean, in principle, I could say yes. Uh, but I think it becomes very problematic when you actually try to parse through what those biases are, whether they're unconscious, the effects that they have. And I think that's borne out by the implicit bias literature.
Of course, yeah, of course
I
it's
don't
very
think it's,
problematic because
but
it's
in principle, I can agree. I mean, in principle, it
I'm
does.
just
I
curious
mean,
whether you think it actually exists or not. Like, like just you personally, putting aside the literature for a second.
yeah, I mean, I guess if you put me on the spot at the moment, I probably, I mean, I might think differently, you know, tomorrow, but I mean, trying to think of an example. I mean, I'm inclined to say I don't know. And the reason I say that is because of the implicit bias, which says in literature, which finds that, for example, people can predict how they'll perform on the test. They can manipulate the test. There's different ways of thinking about what an unconscious bias is. Like, for example, there's the association model, which essentially associates words with people and so on. But then there's proposition model, where you're priming people's beliefs before they make the judgment with particular statements. And so the nature of bias has to be defined, and how it works out in practice, its impact, the origin, so on. All of that has to be worked out. Like, I mean, I'm not trying to be
No, I think
stubborn here.
I think that that's totally legitimate, but it still doesn't. I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree with you. Like there's no one out there disagreeing with that.
Yeah.
I think that there's just an issue of there's people who
I'm just not sure that what we would call unconscious bias in any particular instance is necessarily unconscious. I'm not, in principle, yes. I mean, there could be something, you could be unconscious of it, but I'm not really a big fan of Freud anyway, the whole unconscious and everything. Um, I don't have anything definitive to say. I want to make very clear on this, the whole notion of the unconscious. I'm not a psychologist, and I have a lot of conflicting thoughts about it. So I don't want to say anything definitive on this notion of the unconscious. But to me, I mean, and this is to me, I'm not expressing an opinion or definitive, but in my mind, my understanding, I don't have a very convincing understanding of what it means to say that something is unconscious. You could
You
be
know,
unaware. You could be unaware of it, but I'm not sure that that's the same thing as being unconscious.
well, it's related, right?
It probably is. It
Because
probably
if
is.
it's in your subconscious, that literally means that you're unaware of it. It's not within your consciousness of which the things that you are aware.
But
That's
it's
like
accessible by consciousness,
right.
right? That's the whole
Well,
point
it
of
well
like
it well
psychoanalysis and all that.
you can access your subconscious, right? Like it's possible to access things that are in your subconscious, but it generally takes conscious effort. So you have to know in the first place that you have a subconscious and that there are things there. And once you know that, then you can investigate.
Okay.
But
So,
if
okay.
you dismiss that you have a subconscious, then of course you're never going to access it because you might access it by accident, but like
Wow.
overall you won't.
So I can say, okay, so I don't want to complicate this all. I think that introspection is something that we all benefit from, and that there is a lot about ourselves that we don't know. Isn't there, uh, you know, uh, uh, I don't know if this is related, but there's also the distinction between unconscious and whether you can control something. You don't want to confuse being unconscious and being unable to control, but that's another issue. Um, so,
Well,
I mean, I would say that common sense and would say that, yeah, there probably is something called unconscious bias. I mean, something that we're not aware of.
yeah.
Certainly, it's the case that people can be unintentionally insensitive to people. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think that we can be unaware of the effect that what we say or do or whatever has some kind of harmful impact to greater or lesser degrees on people. Um, and that, in some sense, is the point of the microaggression literature, which itself is problematic in certain ways. But as Scott Lilienfeld says in his literature overview on that, I mean, I don't think anybody should deny that racial insensitivities are a part of modern day life. So, in that sense, yes, I fully agree with you.
Okay. Well,
I
let's.
just, I just, and I apologize for this, but I always feel compelled to, um, in a due diligence kind of way, um, point out the complexities that kind of arise in my mind. But sometimes that can militate against the essential point that yes, we can all acknowledge that there are racial insensitivities that occur in everyday life, and we're not necessarily aware that we commit them. Yes.
I definitely don't think everyone would agree with that statement.
Oh
But
no, I don't. I agree. I don't think people would.
Thanks for watching. For access to the full-length conversation and all of the 2-hour-long unedited conversations that I've had on race, click the support link in the description below. Thanks for your support and see you next time.